It is Friday, October 28th. Let's talk PlayStation. Alright everyone, welcome back. It's been kind of a slow news week if we only compare it to what's been going on lately, where it seems like there's been so much happening, but this past week still plenty to go over in the world of PlayStation. So first up, as always, our PS Plus reminder. This is your last call for the October PS Plus essential games. Grab them before they go away. November 1st, it's going to change over to Nioh 2 on PS4 and PS5, and that also includes Nioh 2 Remastered. Heavenly Bodies, PS4 and PS5 as well, and then the Lego Harry Potter collection on PS4, which this is a very good month, if only because of Nioh 2, so if you have not played that game just yet, definitely check it out. It's so worth it, even if you're not really too interested in it. It's something where just, download it, check it out, see if it's something you can really vibe with. Also, Heavenly Bodies, which is a smaller scale indie title that Sony was promoting for a bit on PS5, and that launched late last year, and I feel like not many got the chance to play that one. And also, the Lego games in general are always they always kind of filled that void for me of just being fun, mindless, and really approachable to play in between some of the other big stuff that you might be messing around with. But overall, it seems like another solid month for PS Plus. Now, getting into our first news story, it looks like Discord voice chat functionality should be coming to PS5 fairly... I wanted to say soon, but that's not really going to work here because if this is to be believed, we're looking at around 5 months until this actually does happen, because what transpired this past week was over on Twitter, the user at AdvaithJ1 shared these screenshots showing an early look at Discord voice integration for PlayStation, and we can see it prompts you to reconnect for new features, and for PS5 only, that's where you can join a voice chat on PS5. Now, if you remember, Tom Henderson had put out a report that the next major PS5 firmware is scheduled for March of next year, and he put out a new report on InsiderGaming.com, again reaffirming that, but he also says that this update is the one that will include more Discord features. And this is apparently the same source that accurately gave him the date for the last major firmware, which turned out to be true. Tom actually mentions in this new report that firmware 6.50, which would be considered a half-step update, that one is scheduled for January 19th. But anyway, looking at these screenshots, this implies that the new mobile app would, or the update to the mobile app, would be required for initiating voice chats on PS5. Now, the good news is, judging by the progress on Xbox, it might not be as tedious, because that was the big concern and criticism there, is that it was, a pain to set up voice chats on Xbox and it required the mobile app. And that's already been adjusted there, where you can join voice channels directly on console, but still, if you want to do direct one-on-one voice chats, that will require the app. But for right now, at least, it seems like they're making decent progress on addressing this and making it more usable directly on console without having to always use the mobile app. And that was the big concern, really. But at least so far, we always knew that more integration was coming, and so we have a decent timeline if, Tom's source is to be believed, which, again, it was very accurate, that last major firmware. So if this is, again, considered a rumor, but if it's accurate, then we're looking at about 5 months until PS5 finally gets that promised Discord tight integration. Moving on to PS5 sales data, we've been talking a lot about how PS5 stock has finally gotten much better, and now we've got some examples of really quantifying just how much better it really has been, because, recently PS5 was number one in both unit sales and dollar sales in the US for the month of August, and now we're seeing for September, which that data recently came out, PS5 was again number one in not only dollar sales, which it's been able to do a few times because PS5 has a higher average selling price, but dollar sales and also unit sales again. So 2 months in a row, finally dethroning Switch, where that's been on such a tear throughout all of last year and this year. So that shows that Sony's finally been able to make more PS5s and fulfill demand. What's interesting is that, now we're seeing anecdotal situations pop up where this viral image popped up on Twitter, PS5s sitting in stock in the wild, 10 to 12 consoles just sitting there in what looks like a Walmart, ready to be sold. I thought that was such a crazy image to see. And so while that might not be the case for everybody everywhere, it was still really just bizarre to see nowadays, right? But we're finally getting there. Nature is indeed healing, and perhaps that will be the case for most retailers by the same time next year. And we can also mention in Japan, PS5 sold over 2 million consoles now, so it crossed over that 2 million unit threshold, that finish line, if you will. And, context is important. We know that PS5 has not been doing too well in Japan because Sony is simply not sending many consoles over there, and it's worth bearing in mind that Japan is not a country that is super into home consoles nowadays. Demand certainly has fallen over a 15-something year period, but still it is something where they finally got there after 101 weeks. If we compare that to PS4, Sony did it in 90 weeks, and PlayStation 3 did it in 73 weeks. So you can see how that played out, basically. Might be able to make the case that if they made more PS5s and sent more to Japan, that of course they would get there faster, but I'm not sure how much faster, because again, it's really something where the country is just not crazy in love with home consoles nowadays. But it's still really unfortunate how it's played out with that country right now, where it's just nigh impossible to get your hands on a PS5. But again, hopefully next year it looks better. Now, getting into God of War Ragnarok news, because like I mentioned last week, the previews were going to go live right when LTPS went live, so of course I could not talk about anything, but so far at least, it seems like the previews have been overwhelmingly positive, at least for what is the opening hours of the game, where that's all they can talk about. But fittingly, the one thing that did come up immediately was God of War Ragnarok's performance modes. We just talked about the whole 30 FPS debacle last week, and so for Ragnarok, there's 4 modes, 2 for most people, which would be 4K 30 FPS, or 1 targeting 60 FPS. But if you do happen to have a 120Hz display with HDMI 2.1, then you can have the option of 4K at 40 FPS, or a high frame rate mode targeting 120 frames per second, which sounds absolutely nuts. What a wild way to play that game. And one really weird thing that also popped up with this whole preview situation was Gene Park of the Washington Post had brought up during their preview of the game that it feels like a PS4 game first and foremost, with it leaning on a noticeable amount of wall shimmies in order to hide loading screens. Now, please bear in mind, the preview was largely positive, but the embargo is rather strict, so that's just one thing that Gene was able to talk about, and that's what caught their eye, right? So we talked about it. But then over on Twitter, some developers did chime in and talk about the inclusion of squeeze sequences and, the kind of things where players are walking through a tight crevice at a slow pace or something. And Kurt Marganog, game director at Naughty Dog, gave a lot of interesting insight on this topic, saying, and I quote, "We used squeeze-throughs to valve the player in to prevent them from going backwards, and boosts are for preventing you from leaving the combat space before everyone is dead, but he can't boost if they're busy shooting. Of course, anytime you're preventing the player from moving forward or back, you are helping with loading. Any valve means you can dump the level behind and start loading the level ahead, but only after the squeeze is finished. So for us, a squeeze through is more for a dramatic effect, wanting to close you in real tight before popping you into an open space, or guaranteeing you're entering the next space from an exact angle, probably have an animated scene you transition to at the end of the squeeze." Grant Parker, game designer at Insomniac Games, also chimed in by saying, "Not a God of War dev, but I've had plenty of experience making squeeze-throughs in 2 Tomb Raider games and adventures. Squeezes were almost never used to load things ahead of them. Pacing, tone, backgating, yes. Loading, I can only think of one example of maybe 100 placed." So it's always great when we have developers chime in to offer, firsthand experience and knowledge on these particular topics, where it seems like it was commonplace knowledge for so many that anytime those sequences pop up, it's always them trying to hide loading. But this is what I was getting at in last week's conversation about the 30 FPS debacle and what it takes to get to 60. We can't always look at a game and make assumptions or broad generalizations on game development. So while you can make some fair assessments on, either it being poor optimization or what's going on with their assets and their world streaming, and why they should be able to knock certain things down to get to 60. We just don't know what's going on under the hood. And so again, it's hard to make those generalizations without, kind of looking silly, right? And that's the thing with 30 FPS and 60, where if you target 30 FPS, it genuinely is something where you can target 30 and make a game where it won't be that feasible to then try and offer 60 without making some massive concessions, right? And that's what that conversation was about. It sort of applies here where there's an expectation of those sequences always being hiding loading, and I can see where most would think that way when we had the Road to PS5 presentation from Mark Cerny, where he specifically does call this out, how there's, windy corridors or a long elevator ride, or Jak 2 where the entire Haven City map was designed around, windy paths to make sure that everything was loading in correctly on time. And so he had mentioned that the PS5 SSD dream is, having a situation where developers do not have to think like that anymore. But this was also where I forget what the video was called, but it was something around that time, I think before PS5 came out, where the PS5 SSD dream still might not be completely realized when there's, still situations where these things might show up in games. And I'm surprised that the wall sequences and the shimmying is used as often as it is for, not loading, basically, right? So, but that's the point, is that they can be there for other reasons. It could be pacing, funneling the player into a particular area, and also cutting that area off so you can't go back, which I know might bother some people, but in the context of a linear game where it's maybe the story implies you can't go back or something, right? I mean, there's always just a lot of narrative choices where you do want to set the tone in a certain way, and you have to push players in that kind of direction where, if you can make it make sense in gameplay, that's why we have so many of those sequences. But I think maybe what Mark was referring to is very much what he discussed, where it is a long, windy, obnoxious corridor or a very long elevator ride. But even in that case, you just might have situations where those things just need to be there in the context of, like, whatever you're playing, right? Maybe there needs to be a long elevator because you're in a high rise. Like, that's why it's tough to make those generalizations. But at least it was really cool to hear the insight that when it comes to squeezing players through a tight area, it's not always loading. And in fact, it seems like more often than not, at least in the case of what Grant Parker has worked on, and also Kurt Marganaw, in this case, we know that it often is for other reasons outside of loading. Now, two things for Ragnarök before we move on, but photo mode is coming after launch, so not there day one, but shouldn't be too long, maybe a few weeks to a month or so, which I think was the exact same case for the 2018 God of War. But yeah, at some point we will have that in the game, which at that point Twitter is going to have a lot of crazy photos because this game is likely going to be very photogenic. And then also, spoilers, just be aware, they are out there. They've actually been out there for about a month or so, but recently there was a situation where somebody reviewing the game was accidentally, without realizing it, sharing screenshots on their Twitter from the first 4 or 5 hours of the game, and I'm sure there's likely more spoilers out there, so just be on high alert, be careful, maybe install that Chrome extension, which allows you to type in keywords and it will block certain things. But at this point, be aware that spoilers are out there for God of War Ragnarök. Now, moving on to some Naughty Dog news, the voice of Abby from The Last of Us Part 2, Laura Bailey, was recently speaking with comicbookmovie.com, and when she was asked about possibly reprising her role to do Abby in A Last of Us Part 3, she said, and I quote, "I would definitely go back to her. I know there was a lot of drama and responses to her character, but it was one of the most influential roles I've had in my life. I would 100% go back to play more Abby if the opportunity came up." Now, I found this noteworthy because, I fully expect that Laura Bailey would enjoy doing Abby again as a character, despite the initial backlash that she saw for doing that character, which is unfortunate, but I'm sure she would enjoy doing the character again. It just really sparked the idea in my head again of a potential Part 3, which, Part 2 certainly does leave some room for the story to continue. And I enjoyed my time with Part 2 a lot, so it's not like I would not like a Part 3, but right on the back of the whole God of War Ragnarök situation where Cory Barlog explained and the whole team debated internally about if they should do 2 games or 3, and they settled on 2 because the basic idea there is that, let's get this done in 2, because if we do 3 games, that's a lot of time being spent on telling one story. And the more I think about that, the more I think more developers and publishers should follow that for their IP, where, you can't spend over a decade on one property. It might be a very successful property, obviously. And, money talks, of course, so it makes sense. It's just, if Naughty Dog follows that same... If Naughty Dog doesn't do that, then we're looking at something where, Part 3 would be... Gosh, that would come out in... For their next major project, right, that would be in the next 3 to 4 years. So we're looking at something where they've skipped an entire generation for a new IP. That would be PlayStation 4, right? So they did Uncharted and Last of Us Part 2. Then we would be going nearly, 14, 15-something years without a new IP out of Naughty Dog. And we know they're a multiple studio team now, but they're doing largely, The Last of Us, right, with Faction. So it just seems like a huge time sink on one property and not having any sort of, nothing new out of Naughty Dog for such a long amount of time. So the more I think about it, the more I would like Part 3 someday, but not in the short term. I want their next game to be a new IP, and I'm hoping that is the case. But I'm sure we'll find out in the next year or so when they're ready to talk about this project. Now, speaking of Factions, we can also move on to our next story, which is Factions possibly being free to play. Up to this point, we still don't know exactly how they're going to approach monetizing this game, if it will be a premium paid title or free to play right off the bat. Well, recently, one Reset Area user, Det, spotted this in a job listing for producer live ops. Under the bonus skills for the job, it reads, proven experience in a production role supporting a AAA free to play live title. Now, that is under the bonus skills. It doesn't imply immediately that that's what this game is going to be, but, my gut thinking here has always been that, okay, this game has succumbed to the typical Naughty Dog scope creep, so it got much bigger than standard faction matches that we saw in the first game, so what does that look like? And to me, it looks like a larger scale PvP, but also PvE environment, kind of like The Division, or also, Outriders, right? You could play that by yourself. So in theory, you could play this game alone if you want to, but it's best to, group up with people and kind of go at it in the environment with, a squad and, try to find resources and fight against clickers and things like that. And you'll naturally run into other players. And so that's kind of how I thought this game would be, and if it takes that route, then I see them charging money for it up front. But if it is a free-to-play game, then I find it hard to think that they would offer that for free. So that's all speculation on my part, because we still don't really know what the game is going to be. I could be wrong there, but that's how I've always seen it. And, we won't have to wait long anyway, because early next year is when we will hear more about this game and hopefully have that answer for us the first time they're ready to reveal more. Now, the really big Naughty Dog news story this past week was the possibility of a brand new Uncharted game being in development and Sony building a new team for this game. Or at the very least, it should be Uncharted. There's not many other things this could be, but here's what played out. So the Reset Area user, Kostas Kurtas, spotted this in a job listing for a senior producer at PlayStation. This is a remote job, but it says, and I quote here, Sony PlayStation is building a new internal game development team in partnership with PlayStation Studios Visual Arts, an award-winning full production group that specializes in animation, motion capture, cinematics, art, and scanning. This high-visibility project is being developed in collaboration with Naughty Dog. Though currently unannounced, we have a clear vision and plan to release. Using our existing expertise and premier talent, we will guarantee a high visual quality bar for the game and a compelling experience for our players. Now, we've already had a good idea that they have a new project at the Visual Arts Group, but as far as I know, this is the first time they've directly called out a collaboration with Naughty Dog with a brand new development team. And really the thing that sealed the deal here was another job listing that recently popped up for a game design intern, and this one says they're a new studio based in San Diego that reads, and I quote, currently, we are co-developing an exciting new project with Naughty Dog in a beloved franchise. Under responsibilities, it says, assist with design-oriented tasks on an exciting Sony IP-based project. Now, based on that criteria alone, we can really pin down what this is likely going to be, and I'm sure some could get technical and say it's a Sony IP and not strictly Naughty Dog, but that seems silly given the context. So if it's Naughty Dog, there's not many games to choose from, and so while I would love this alternate timeline where it's Jak and Daxter, I think we can rule that out if we're being reasonable here. I don't see that being a thing. So, again, it would be cool, but, like, I don't think it's Jak and Daxter. How about The Last of Us? Well, that I don't see either, because if they do end up doing part 3, you know, Naughty Dog's going to want to do that in-house and completely oversee that project and not share development or have another studio do it entirely. I just don't see that either. And so maybe a Last of Us spinoff, but what seems like the number one candidate here is a brand new Uncharted game, or maybe the Uncharted 1 remake that Sony was, you know, going to do, or I should say the Visual Arts Service Group, because that's how that played out. If you remember, this all sounds familiar because that's how we got the Last of Us Part 1 remake. The Visual Arts Service Group is a jack-of-all-trades support studio within Sony that does, you know, like they said, mocap, audio, cinematics, animation. They do all that stuff for multiple PlayStation studios. And around 2018, a small team wanted to, you know, make their own project essentially. And so they didn't necessarily have Sony's blessing right away, but they wanted to kind of make a prototype and try to make a cool build or vertical slice that they could present to Sony and get the green light for doing their own game from the ground up, which would have been interesting for what was at the time a support studio. At first, they looked at Uncharted. They decided that game would take too much to completely remake, and so they then chose The Last of Us. Once Sony came in and really looked at the project seriously, that was when Herman Hulst took over as the head of PS Studios. He thought it was too expensive, but if they were going to eventually do it, then okay, we'll hand it over to Naughty Dog and they will lead and oversee the project. And that is more or less the story we've been given, and so far that is how this has played out, and that's why the Part 1 remake wasn't, like, you know, pushed by Sony right off the top. But now we've got something very similar, and even over on Twitter, Michael Mumbauer, formerly of the Visual Arts Service Group, he had mentioned how this seems very similar, deja vu. I mean, yeah, that's kind of what's playing out here. And if you remember the report that came out from Jason Schreier detailing a lot of this stuff, he also mentioned that at a certain point, Ben Studio was being tasked with making a new Uncharted before they asked to be taken off of that project and do their own thing. So clearly the interest is indeed still there. I just think there's so many breadcrumbs being laid out for what is easily another Uncharted, and it would be a brand new studio that would be able to handle this IP, and Naughty Dog could oversee and handle the project. It sounds like this is a brand new team, but perhaps it is co-development like this job listing implies. But either way, you know, Uncharted 4 was the last major entry back in 2016. You know, The Lost Legacy certainly fared well as a smaller experience. The movie did incredibly well recently. It's not like Sony's going to let this IP be completely done right now, and so it might be time for a brand new entry to finally show up, right? I think the wait has been long enough. If we assume that it takes a, you know, standard 3.5-4 year dev cycle, possibly a bit longer, right? So it'll be a while until this game is done, but more Uncharted, not really a bad thing, especially if it's a brand new team that, you know, otherwise we weren't going to get this to begin with. But it seems like an exciting prospect. We'll see how this plays out. Moving on to our next story, we finally have some details on London Studios' next game for PS5, which thus far we've only had brief descriptors from job listings where it's been labeled as an online multiplayer live service title for PS5. More recent job listings implied that it was going to be fantasy-based in some way, and now that is confirmed. This game is going to be an untitled online co-op game set in fantasy London, or at least so far it's an untitled game, but it is going to be a co-op title based in a fantasy London. The co-studio head, Stuart White, when speaking with GamesIndustry.biz, says, and I quote, "We are proud of the history and innovation that we've done over the years, supporting all sorts of PlayStation technology, whether that's VR or AR or microphones or whatever. With this project, we really wanted to explore some new avenues and set ourselves some new challenges. We definitely wanted to try something a little bit different, and I think this new project really channels our brave value and allows us to push ourselves on the curious front too. It's an exciting future, it really is." Both Stuart White and the other studio head, Tara Saunders, go on to discuss the core values at London Studio, how they will continue to focus on innovation and apply it here, and they say this is their most ambitious project thus far, being built specifically for PlayStation 5 with a newly rebuilt version of their Soho engine. There's also more things they discuss in the article on GamesIndustry.biz. I'll link it down below, but they discuss their challenges of leaving that lineage behind, of doing all this crazy, innovation stuff with PlayStation, which is what they've largely done for so long, right? With PlayStation Eye games, SingStar, PlayStation Move, now PSVR, which their last game was Blood and Truth, and now they're going back to a standard 2D release. And they talked to a lot of other PlayStation studios, and namely with Guerrilla Games, how they approached going from Killzone to Horizon. They learned a lot there, and so that's how they're really approaching this. But, obviously it's another live service title, and I know that's not going to appeal to most people, but at least we have a good idea of what this game actually is going to be, a fantasy-based co-op game, which that alone might be interesting enough, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a PvP style thing. They could be building this ongoing narrative that you play with another player, or say a group of friends, right? That could be a distinct possibility of how this game really sets itself apart. But I can't wait to see what this game is going to be, right? So, I've always said myself, like, I'm not a multiplayer person. I'm not. So despite Sony having 12 live service games being planned for the next 3-4 years, right? Despite that, I still want to see how it pans out, because this is the PlayStation Studios pedigree, right? They're so well known for these blockbuster, fantastic, polished AAA single-player experiences, and to see them really go all in on live service, I just can't wait to see how it plays out, right? And I know there's definitely going to be a lot of, throwing certain ideas at the wall to see what sticks, and at least in this climate today with so many live service games, there are many that hit the wall and they fall down immediately. But a lot of these publishers, they just want that one game to hit, and if it does, it pays a massive amount of dividends for them. But with London Studio, this one in particular, I really want to see how it pans out. It's a big curiosity of mine, and now we have a good idea of what it's going to look like. And it's also worth pointing out that this certainly follows the formula of announcing something so early, and how they've announced it really implies that they're looking for more talent for this particular game, right? So going to GamesIndustry.biz, there was also an SIE blog post, so they're not really, making this well known in public from their main consumer-focused channels. They are looking for talent on this, on this game in particular. So they're certainly staffing up in a big way. Next up, if you remember, we talked about how Hideo Kojima posted a picture on Twitter of him posing with some SIE executives, and he's done more of that lately, which now it's with Herman Hulst, the head of PS Studios, and also the big man himself, Jim Ryan, which obviously this adds more evidence to the possibility of a Death Stranding 2. I think that much is certain, but lately we've seen a lot of SIE corporate folk, the one that are well known and even lesser known, they're all like in Japan right now, which I think is just largely because the border is finally open for Japan, so people can finally come into the country completely unrestricted. So I think that's just a lot of that's going on right now, where all these planned site visits that were delayed for so long, they're finally able to do that. But still interesting to see Kojima just be so open about it nowadays, which, I mean, he always was to a degree. And recently he was in a conversation with The Guardian where he talked about one of these projects that he's working on and how it's going to really transform the medium. And it's this crazy ambitious project where he wants to be the first one to accomplish it. And the technology just wasn't there before, and now it finally is. I think in the context of what he's describing, that's actually the Microsoft Xbox cloud-based project. So not Death Stranding 2, but still always fun to follow and keep up with his antics. And it seems like Death Stranding 2 might be very close to a reveal, maybe at the Game Awards. Now, getting into a topic that I certainly care a lot about, and I know most people don't, but it's always worth bringing this up since there is so much, there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding it, and it's, disc playback and what's actually on a disc. What happened recently was the discovery that for Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, the game has a grand total of 70 megabytes on the disc, and once you insert it into your PS5, it's going to pull a near 120, 140 something gigabyte download. essentially meaning that there's nothing on the disc, no game, absolutely nothing. But this is the misconception that is so prevalent nowadays, is that some seem to think that's always the case, which is not true. The vast majority of games that come out today across PS5, even Series X, and Nintendo Switch include full playable builds on the disc, on the game card, and they're fully playable and installable offline. We did a video on that a few months back, which showcased how all platform holders handle console DRM, offline play, things like that. In fact, Microsoft has made some improvements, so that video is a bit outdated, but the point still stands. That showcases what is possible on modern hardware. It's something where the discs are not glorified licenses. You have a full game on disc, just the act of copying the game to your console's local storage, and then the disc does act as an authenticator that you own the game, right? Sure, that's how it happens nowadays, but we're sort of ignoring the fact that you copied a full game from the disc, right? So this is an egregious use of wasting a print on a Blu-ray, essentially, right? Because these things can hold 100 gigabytes of data, and they've stored nothing but essentially the bare minimum to pull the download from PSN. Absolutely lame. I do not like when publishers do this, and this is I guess they've been doing this for recent Call of Duty releases. I didn't know, but this certainly is the worst offender so far. I will always advocate for having a full build on disc that's playable offline, and I understand the case and the argument of day one patches. How reliable is a game on day one if you can't install the day one patch, which is so prevalent nowadays? And hey, totally valid, but it's always worth having some kind of complete build that you can play without internet if that was the case. And mind you, you still completely have the game. You can sell it to a friend, trade it in at retail or something. You certainly do own the game, despite what some might think. And there's also the chance that a long-running game that has multiple prints, that is something where you end up getting new discs printed, and those will carry the most recent patches, right? So there's certainly examples where you have the most recent up-to-date build on a disc, and that's great too. That's what I love about physical media, is that you do have the kind of leverage that some seem to think you don't nowadays. And it's unfortunate that, at least for this game, this is how they're handling it, where at the bare minimum, it's got a single-player campaign. At least put that on there, right? It would make sense to not have to shove all the multiplayer stuff on there. That will require internet at some point if you want to play it. But not having the campaign on there is pretty bogus, and I really don't like when publishers do this. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter, and if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, it's very easy. You can follow the link down below. Supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories that I wanted to talk about you all from this past week, and our Tuesday video was looking at some PS5 accessories again from Wish.com. It's been a while since I picked up some weird accessories from there, and sure enough, most of them are still pretty bad, so go check that out. And as always, another upload next Tuesday, but until then, that is it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.